What is the Rod of Seven Parts? GameMasters here, and yeah, we're going to dive deep into what this old school artifact is, where it's been, what it can do, and speculate what it's all about in the new Vecna adventure. A few days ago, I did a video where we showed the back of the cover of the new Vecna Eve of Ruin adventure that is due out soon. Part of the blurb on the back states that the adventurers will need to team up with 3 archmages, trek across the multiverse, and rebuild the Rod of Seven Parts in order to save the multiverse from obliteration. And I gotta admit, that sounds pretty damn exciting. But what does this rod actually do? What powers does it hold, and how could it be possibly used to end the multiverse? We'll speculate that in a bit, but first I want to go back to the beginning. Check out what the Rod of Seven Parts was like old school. Back in 1976, Gary Gygax put out a supplement for Dungeons & Dragons called Eldritch Wizardry. This would be our first look at the Rod of Seven Parts. The description found here translates into what we would later find a bit more in depth in the 1979 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. Deep on page 160 and 161 of that DMG, we get a good description of the Rod of Seven Parts. The first thing we know right off the bat is that it is a legendary artifact and that it was created by a group called the Wind Dukes of Aqua. They created it to resolve a war in which chaos and law battled. During that battle, the rod itself was shattered. You guessed it, into 7 parts. Each part is different in length, but here's where it gets interesting. It states, and I'll read direct from the description here, no single part has any power or effect alone. Now remember that because as time passes and new editions of D&D come out, that will change. It further goes on to say that should you find the first part of the rod, that by simply holding it, you will get a feeling as to which direction the second part lies in, but that it won't point you to a lower piece, so seek out the last piece first. It also explains that should you find the parts and attempt to put them together out of order, for example, should you find the second part and the fifth part and try to fit them together, the higher number piece, in this example the second part, will be teleported away in a random direction from 100 to 1,000 miles away. Joining 3 parts correctly together will bind the rod to you, and you will be unable to let it go until all 7 parts are joined. Should you assemble all 7 parts, the entire rod will be about 5 feet in length. While it states that no single part has any power on its own, joining 2 or more does open up some power and effects. However, this version of the Dungeon Master's Guide made it so that the DM is the one that comes up with those powers and effects. Once fully assembled in the correct order, each time the rod is used to access its prime power, there's a 5% chance that the entire rod will disassemble into its 7 separate pieces and teleport 100 to 1,200 miles away in random directions. Simply put, just finding all 7 parts of this rod, old school, would be a challenge, but even in just assembling it would be a risk, as how would you then locate a piece of a rod that was teleported randomly up to 1,000 or 1,200 miles away? What if it was teleported straight down? How would you even know unless you had that initial piece to sense the direction that the next part was in? Moving to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, 2nd edition, and again it mentions the Wind Dukes of Aqua. Most of the information is similar to the 1st edition, but it goes on to explain that the rod itself was broken apart in the slaying of Miska, the wolf spider, the consort of the Queen of Chaos. The Dukes then took up the 7 parts and scattered them throughout the world itself. In this version, the Rod of 7 Parts, any piece can lead to its adjoining piece. It also states that should you assemble them out of order, instead of randomly teleporting up to 1,000 miles away, the piece can be teleported randomly somewhere else in the entire world. But here's where it gets interesting. We are provided with actual powers that the rod might have, at least as suggested powers, as the DM is still free to customize it to have whatever power or effect it is that they see fit. Suggested powers are immunity to 1 attack form, fly at will, cure light wounds, true seeing, hold monster, double character's movement, and slow. It also suggests that a fully assembled rod might have restoration and shape change. Now, this next part is what I think could be a game changer against Vecna in this new adventure, Eve of Ruin. Again, Vecna is hell-bent on getting the pieces of the rod to obliterate the multiverse. But let me pose this. Would someone bent on law want to obliterate the multiverse? I'm very well aware that Vecna is full on chaos and evil, but get this. The last little bit of the 2nd edition AD&D's description for the Rod of 7 Parts says this. Created to the service of order, the rod changes its user to an absolute follower of law, even more so than the most rigid lawful good. The character will feel compelled to intervene in all things to maintain the primacy of law over chaos, heedless of the effects for good or ill. Those not adhering to the rod holder's strict views are perceived as enemies. Now perhaps Vecna will be influenced by that to become an absolute follower of law, and will feel compelled to obliterate the multiverse, not because of an evil intent, but because the view is that there is ultimately so much chaos out there that the only way to structure law is to eliminate everything, even though that action would be considered an ill effect. Just something to ponder. There is another advanced D&D book that also explores the Rod of Seven Parts, the Dungeons & Dragons Tomes book, The Rod of Seven Parts. It is in this book that we learn of some in-depth powers that the rod itself has. This is an adventure that takes players to travel the world to assemble the rod to prevent an evil entity from using it, to bring back Miska. We also learn that the Winddukes are a race known as the Vati, although we actually learned that information in Dragon Magazine issue 224 in an expose that Skip Williams wrote. And while I'm not going to go into the details of the adventures, spoilers and all, but I will offer up that if anyone wants to know that adventure in detail, slap that like button. If we get, say, 800 likes, then I'll do an in-depth look at that adventure. But I want to take a look at how it depicts the Rod of Seven Parts. We get a great image of it, detailing the length of each part, but also, too, we learn that each part has a command word that will, in turn, activate that segment's power. The tip, which is 4 inches, when given the command word Ruit, will allow you to cast Cure Light Wounds up to 5 times a day, whereas the 7th segment is 15 inches in length and can cast Heal once a day upon using its command Rex. And here's where it gets clever. The command words are Ruit, Colium, Fiat, Justitia, Isi, Lex, Rex, which translates roughly to, though chaos reign, let justice be done. Behold, law is king. What's also interesting is that in this book, we get this explanation about the Rod of Seven Parts. The rod itself undergoes subtle changes each time it enters a new world, and its power during this adventure, meaning the adventure that's found in this Tomes book, are slightly different from those previously attributed to it. Before we move to 3rd edition, I want to first thank these Rod of Seven Parts supporters. Their contributions to the channel have been impactful to me and have allowed me certain freedoms with the content that I make for this channel, and I really cannot thank them enough. So, thank you. Regarding 3rd edition, well, and 3.5, I've scoured the Dungeon Masters guides, and I wasn't really able to find any mention of the Rod of Seven Parts within. And I don't recall it being in there, but I do remember a book called Arms and Equipment Guide, and we are given some good details about the Rod of Seven Parts in that. It too talks about the rod being created by the Winddukes and ultimately being sundered during the battle against the Queen of Chaos, but it also specifies that the fragments themselves retain some magic. Like what we saw in the Tomes book from 2nd edition, this version of the rod also uses command words, but also states that the powers are as follows. The smallest segment, the 4-inch tip, can cure light wounds. The 5-inch segment can cast slow. The 6th-inch segment can cast haste. The 8th inch can create a gust of wind. The 10-inch segment can provide true seeing. The 12-inch segment can hold monster. And the 7th segment, which is 15 inches, can cast heal. Should a non-lawful character possess a single segment, they have to make a willpower save each week. Otherwise, their alignment will shift to lawful. But by having that shift happen, they then can concentrate to find the next larger segment, which too is similar in how finding the parts worked in the advanced AD&D edition. Adding to the lore, 3rd edition also states that 2 segments joined together will allow the wielder to fly at will. 3 segments grant the wielder spell resistance, and it can be used as a +1 light mace. 4 segments grant control wind, and it functions as a +2 heavy mace. 5 segments grant shape change, and it acts as a +3/+3 quarterstaff. 6 segments, that's a hard word to say, let you wind walk, and it functions as a +4/+4 quarterstaff. Completing the Rod of Seven Parts, putting them all in order, grants the use of control weather, whirlwind, and greater restoration. Plus, the rod itself acts as a +5/+5 quarterstaff. Plus, you can use it to cast True Resurrection, but in doing so, causes it to shatter, which in turn scatters its pieces across various worlds and planes. Incorrectly trying to piece it together, just as in the previous editions, will cause the larger segment to teleport away in a random direction, but this time 1d10 times 100 miles away. But it does also cite that because the dimensions of the rod are so precise, that it's easy to tell which one goes where. Remember, the smallest section is the tip, and the longer section goes below that, ending in 15-inch segment. Shifting to 4th edition, and things get a touch strange. And this information isn't found in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but is instead found in the DM's Guide Book 2. The Rod of Seven Parts is still categorized as an artifact, and its segments still range from 4 inches to 15 inches. But But the Wind Dukes are now known as a group of 7 angels that served Bahamut. Miska, the wolf spider, is a demonic primordial, and it is the shoving of the rod into Miska's body that causes the rod to break apart and scatter across the cosmos. As with previous editions, by holding a segment and concentrating, you'll know the direction where the next larger piece lies. I'm also not going to go into the rules of 4th edition. I mean, while the Rod of 7 Parts isn't sentient in and of itself, 4th edition does detail the rod's concordance, its attitude towards the wielder. Okay, breaks down like this. The artifact knows that it's been wielded before and that the individual holding it now will likely not be the permanent owner. As such, the artifacts in 4th edition have their own unique goals. The Rod of 7 Parts has 3. To be united into a whole item once again, to establish the divine rule of law and destroy the remaining primordials, and to seek out and destroy Miska, the wolf spider, once and for all. Regarding the rod's concordance, again, this is all weird rules from 4th edition. Depending on how you act, will determine how the rod feels about you. Should you act dishonorably with it, there's a chance that it can separate and teleport away. Should it be pleased with your actions, there is a chance it could grant you a legendary boon, such as Heartblood of Festigrim. And yeah, I mean, take a look at this. Like I said, rules for 4th edition were just a touch on the strange side. Cruising up to current edition, 5th edition, and guess what? There really isn't much that talks about the Rod of 7 Parts. We have a small blurb in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons provided to us in the context of possible ideas for a campaign and how to integrate dragons into that campaign. It reads, when an artifact called the Rod of Law was shattered into 7 parts during the Battle of Pesh, 7 ancient metallic dragons were assigned to be the guardians of its fragments. And aside from that, there is scant mentionings of this artifact anywhere in the whole of 5th edition. It's not really even mentioned in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition. What's unusual about this is the duration that 5th edition has been out, since 2014, we only see a small few mentions of it, but nothing in depth, save for now, on the back of this new Vecna book. And while it too is but a brief mention, we can at least ponder what the book itself will actually say about the Rod of 7 Parts. Now, I had a lot of fun researching this and remembering the history and lore of the Rod of 7 Parts, and of course, there is a fair bit more to it, but what we've gone over here covers the most important elements, at least what I see them to be leading into this new Vecna book. So let's speculate and ponder. How involved would this rod be in the new book? I mean, I'm pretty sure that it's going to be pretty damn involved, but do you think it will stick to what's mostly been established in historical lore, or do you think we'll see a completely new history for it? Do you think the obelisks that have been peppered throughout 5th edition will have any involvement? What about the weavers that created those obelisks? It's all been hinted at that these things are all connected to Vecna in some way. Talk to me down in the comments, though. What other secrets are you aware of about this rod that I didn't cover? What are your speculations? Again, talk to me down in the comments, and until next our paths cross, may you not put the wrong segment of the Rod of 7 Parts in the wrong spot and find it teleported away.